So I recently finished watching a show that was so weird and so confusing that by the end of it, I had absolutely no idea how I felt about it. Because it's a show that, in my opinion, somehow manages to be both a technical filmmaking masterpiece as well as absolutely awful, all at the exact same time. And that show is called... So I gotta be honest, usually when I'm done with a show or a movie, I'll say that I liked it, or that I hated it, or that I thought it was whatever. But with this, after finishing it, I just couldn't tell you what I thought. I know that a lot of people love to overanalyze it and look for a deeper meaning, but without giving anything away, I'm just gonna call it what it was. Some bullshit thrown together for the sake of shock factor. And I want to get this out of the way, it is definitely not a show that I would recommend to everyone, especially if you're someone who has a hard time with situations that give you the feeling of secondhand embarrassment. And let me be clear, I'm someone who will watch stuff that's cringe and feel a little uneasy, but there were moments in this show that made me wish I was doing something a little more enjoyable, like chewing on glass or maybe putting a toothpick under my big toenail and kicking a wall. Because man, this show is uncomfortable to watch. And the thing is, that's totally intentional. However, the reason I suffered through watching the whole thing was because on a technical level, I think that this was an absolute filmmaking masterclass. And even though I thought the story was garbage, I think the cinematography and the editing carried it so hard that I would say it's worth it watching for those alone because there is so much that you can learn from them. So it's written and created by Nathan Fielder and Benny Safdie. Some of you might recognize Benny Safdie because he was also one of the directors and writers for Uncut Gems along with his brother, and that is a whole other topic. But for those of you who have seen it, let's just say that when you know that, it starts to make a lot more sense why The Curse feels the way it does. So the show follows the story of a married couple called Whitney and Asher, played by Emma Stone and Nathan Fielder, who designed these modern, sustainable living eco houses in kind of a small community, lower income area of New Mexico, and then they sell them to rich people. There's a reality TV show about them being filmed within the show with the help of their friend Dougie, who is played by Benny Safdie himself. And The Curse itself is shot in what I can call this combination between a documentary and a behind-the-scenes style, meaning that it has this raw, improvised, fly-on-the-wall feel to it. And this video is about the technical stuff, but I just want to quickly mention the main cast. Emma Stone does a great job. Like, she made me absolutely hate her character. She is annoying and cringy, and that is exactly what the intention was. Then we've got Nathan Fielder, whose character is also super cringy and awkward, which again was absolutely the goal. But for those of you who have seen Nathan For You, you would probably know what I'm talking about when I say that Nathan Fielder is awkward as shit. And at this point, I'm honestly not sure if he's a master at acting or if that's just how he is day to day and there is zero acting going on. And finally, we've got Benny Safdie as Dougie, who is maybe the character I hated the most in the entire show for a bunch of reasons that I am not gonna get into. But the point is, credit where credit's due, they actually all do a great job making their characters as unlikable as possible, which was kind of what they were going for. So at one point, one of the main characters does something really stupid for the reality TV show and has an interaction with a child who curses him. And then wacky things start happening and the viewer is left to wonder if everything that's going on is because of... Through the whole thing, we follow the main storyline, which is all of the issues that the main characters are having in their marriage while also trying to juggle filming a reality TV show. And there are a bunch of other topics and themes that the show tries to tie into this, which bring a lot of moral and ethical questions with them. But that's one of the main reasons why I thought it was so bad. There was just too much packed into it. A bunch of storylines that just go nowhere and a main storyline that fell completely flat. But that's about as far as I'm gonna go about the story because I honestly thought that it was awful. But like I said, luckily there were other elements of the show that were strong enough to carry it and to keep me watching. Like I already mentioned a few times, the entire show aims to make you feel awkward and uneasy and the absolute peak of secondhand embarrassment anytime a character does anything. And on a technical level, things like the lens choices, the camera movements, framing, composition, editing, sound design, music choices, and the color grading all increase those feelings by 100 times. So I want to start by talking about the lens choices. I tried looking into exactly what lenses were used to film The Curse, and I found some info pointing at long Panavision lenses, but regardless of what brand it is, I'm willing to guess that it was mostly, if not entirely, some sort of zoom lenses. But if you know anything more about that, feel free to drop a comment and let me know because I'm genuinely interested in knowing if I'm actually right about it. Now, leaving the super technical stuff aside, the lens choice, and more accurately the choice of focal lengths, was one thing that immediately stood out to me. There are scenes where characters are going to be having a conversation about something that is clearly very personal and uncomfortable for them, and oftentimes in those scenes, all the shots are on these super tight focal lengths, which brings us, the viewers, as close to the action as possible, forcing you to be right there in the moment with the characters, even though you really don't want to be there. And then on the other hand, we've sometimes got scenes where the characters will be having an awkward interaction, which isn't necessarily as deeply personal, and those are going to be filmed with shots that are a little bit wider, but still on longer focal lengths. And those slightly wider shots still make you feel uncomfortable, but this time it's not because you're right up close with the action. Instead, it's because it makes the viewer feel like they're spying on the situation from afar and listening to a conversation that they clearly shouldn't be able to hear at that distance. And the reason this works so well for building up that uneasy tone of the show is that within the context of the reality TV show that the characters are filming, while they're on set, they're always wearing a microphone pack, or there's like boom microphones around them. And even when they're not on set, you still kind of feel like someone hid a microphone somewhere around the characters. And that basically means that it doesn't matter where we are as the viewer, you can always hear what's going on. And assuming you're not a weirdo, that should make you feel uncomfortable. So the lens choices definitely work really well for that documentary behind the scenes style the cinematography is meant to go for. And something else that also ties into this really well are the camera moves. Now, for the most part, the camera moves are pretty minimal. A lot of the shots are going to be on a tripod, and if the camera is moving for those, it's going to be through panning and tilting. And in the cases of these locked off shots, the feelings of unease and awkwardness come mainly from the stuff that the characters are talking about and the situations that are being created by that. Often, but not always. Sometimes the panning and tilting is done for these long tracking shots, which in combination with some very intentional camera placement make it look and feel like you're spying on the characters from behind bushes or through windows or across the street. But then for some scenes, you might notice that they try to go with a subtle handheld look with a bit of shakiness. And while the locked off shots make you feel like this really well prepared stalker that's tracking someone, the handheld ones make you feel more like the weirdo in the room who's holding a camera that you're trying to pretend isn't on, but it's definitely on and everybody can tell that it's on. And then sometimes you've got these one-off specialty shots that are kind of like little treats every now and then. For example, there's this one shot early on in the show where the camera is on a dolly and it pushes into the peephole of a door so that we can listen in on a conversation that the characters are having just outside of it in the hallway. And then, as soon as the conversation is over, the camera dollies back out as if you're a stalker that's backing away from the door. Another great one is this shot where Emma Stone's character Whitney walks out of her house and starts walking down the street, but you see that with a point of view angle from inside a car that's waiting right in front of her house. The car hangs back for a few seconds and starts moving after she's already left, drives past her, and keeps going. And this is a shot that I want to talk about a bit more in a second when we get to the editing for the show. But very often the camera isn't even moving at all, and instead the way that the tension is built up is with the use of a ton of long, slow zooms. And those are sick. If we start really close up and gradually zoom out, it creates this uneasy feeling of trying to get out of an awkward situation, but still being able to hear everything that's going on, even though you kind of don't want to. And on the flip side, if the shot starts by being a little bit wider and then slowly zooms in, it makes you feel like you've just stumbled into a really uncomfortable moment and now you're kind of stuck in it. And pretty much all the time, all of these camera moves or lack of camera moves are paired really well with very thoughtful framing and composition. I should also bring up that this show breaks a lot of the rules of traditional cinematography. Like in most shots, there are choices being made that would usually be considered wrong a lot of the time. Characters find themselves in these frames within the frame, but they will be cut off by them in different ways, oftentimes framed and composed with very little room around them, and especially in the direction where they're looking. Or during conversations, you might notice that characters are placed in a way where it has them looking at walls or random objects in the foreground that are covering whoever they're talking to in the most inconvenient way. And this is partially because of the fact that the camera is almost never directly looking at any of the characters. It's usually through windows or objects in the foreground. And a lot of filmmakers will stay away from this style of composition and framing, specifically because it can leave the viewer with an uncomfortable feeling. Almost creates this impression of being trapped, but in the context of the curse, all of those things work perfectly exactly for that. Something else I want to make note of that really stood out to me is the use of reflections as a framing and composition tool. There are a bunch of moments in the show when characters are going to find themselves around these smooth, reflective surfaces or straight up mirrors, and instead of looking at the people, the camera is looking at their reflection. And you'll still see this frame within a frame stuff, but now there's also the added element of the slight, or in some cases, even very heavy distortion from the reflected image. And depending on how distorted the person looks on whatever surface we're looking at them on, that is one more way that the curse makes you feel uneasy. By making you look at twisted proportions and features of a person that you were just looking at a second ago looking normal. So when you've got the combination of a well-picked lens, a frame within a frame where the character is set up in a way that just doesn't look right, maybe a weird reflection and a long slow zoom, it really makes you appreciate how intentional they were when editing this thing and picking what elements they wanted for each shot. But when it comes to the editing, I think the best part about it is that there's nothing flashy. It is simple and really just comes down to a really deep understanding of what the intended tone was for the show and making the best possible decisions in favor of that tone. And a great example of one of those decisions, at least for me, is how and when different scenes are cut. Pretty much every shot in every scene feels like it's been given enough time to breathe. You hear the conversation, you see the situation, and then you've got enough time to sit with the feeling that that's left you with. In fact, I would even say that a lot of the scenes are given too much time to breathe, which would normally be a bad thing because it leaves this awkward pause after all is said and done. But here, considering the tone of the show, that is perfectly on brand. Like, remember that one point of view shot that I mentioned earlier from inside the car? That shot stays on screen for 1 minute and 13 seconds before there's a cut in it. No dialogue, just the sounds of a car interior along with some really creepy sound design, which I'll talk about in a second. There's also this other shot that I wanted to talk about where the main characters just walk and talk for 2 minutes and 19 seconds, and that entire time the camera is tracking them with a long lens from afar. The image is going in and out of focus, and there's a bunch of stuff like fences and branches and who knows what else that shows up and disappears from the foreground. But there are no cuts at all. And I love that shot because it fits so well with what's already been established as the editing style for the show, but more than that, because it serves the tone of the entire thing so well. There's no close-ups of one person talking and then reaction shots of the other person. They're both in the frame the entire time, and it's got this weird look and feel that makes it seem like someone is stalking them. And those shots are both great reminders that this show doesn't care about going for traditional coverage. It doesn't try to show you as much as possible. It just needs to show you the best possible angle that will make you feel the most uncomfortable. But while we're talking about the editing, I want to bring up something that ties into it. And even though I think on a technical level, everything already comes together really well, the sound design and music choices are without a doubt a key part of building up the tone for different scenes so well. Occasionally, we'll see these short segments that the characters are filming for their reality TV show, and anytime there's music in one of those segments, it's gonna be the standard upbeat, happy, carefree music that you would hear in reality TV shows or corporate videos.
Your arm's getting sore?
Yeah.
Right? It's a workout.
Asher has been taking comedy classes.
But then for most of the other scenes, there's either going to be no music at all and it's just going to be dialogue and sound effects, or it'll be these ambient, sometimes electronic tracks that usually sound very unnerving and tense. And what I find interesting is that for a lot of other shows, this contrast between the genres used would be really out of place because of how jarring it is to hear them in back-to-back scenes. But for The Curse, the fact that something like that is jarring makes it the perfect tool to help with the full-body cringe experience that you're already getting by just watching what's going on. And when it comes to sound effects, aside from the usual everyday sounds from the locations where stuff takes place and the environments, every now and then you'll hear these drones or risers or hits almost like you would hear in horror movies or thrillers.
Thank you.
But this show is supposed to be a comedy, and that is not the type of sound design that most people would go with for a comedy. But again, that is another way that the genius of the editing for this show reveals itself, because within the context of what you're watching, creepy sounding low drones and risers actually feel like they go along with it perfectly, just like they do in that point of view car shot that I keep bringing up. And for better or worse, sound design is something that will go unnoticed by a lot of people in movies and shows, but it is not the only thing that flies under the radar. And something else that's kind of like that is the color. And the color grading choices in The Curse are yet another example of a subtle detail that goes a long way for building the world that your characters are gonna live in. The color grading is actually pretty grounded in reality. It is a little on the warmer side, a bit desaturated, but it looks pretty natural overall, and considering the documentary behind the scene style, not having it be hyper stylized works well. But one thing that's immediately obvious is just how heavy the grain is in almost every shot, and I say almost for a reason. So from what I've read, they initially wanted to go with 16mm film for the show, which would have given them all of this grain directly in camera, but for whatever reason they eventually ended up going digital with an Arri Alexa Mini and just added the grain in post. And the grain in The Curse is really heavy-handed, but it's not just because the colorists liked grain and decided to crank it up. The reason it's so intense is actually because it's meant to contrast with the very smooth and perfect and overly clean look of the homes being filmed. And when we're looking at clips being filmed for the reality TV show, the aspect ratio will change and all of that grain will go away, which is why I said that it's there for almost every shot. The color grade will become slightly more saturated and brighter and more like what you would see in an actual reality show. And the juxtaposition of those elements is another way that this show tries to make the viewer feel uneasy, because we're looking at these pristine houses, these shiny reflective surfaces and interiors that again are supposed to be perfect, but we're looking at them through all of this grain which creates texture that you can clearly tell shouldn't have a place in those environments. But then sometimes you get to look at what the reality TV show wants to present to its audience, and that looks totally different and fake, and something about that just feels off. But that's the point of this show. Everything in here, even as far as the smallest technical detail, is meant to feel off. So yeah, that's The Curse, a cinematography and editing masterpiece that is cursed to forever be paired with an absolute dumpster fire of a story. Like, it's almost impressive how you can make something that is so well crafted so hard to sit through. And I think I've already made it pretty clear that I wouldn't recommend this to most people, because unless you really enjoy feeling uncomfortable for hours, then it's not exactly a fun watch. But if you're into filmmaking, cinematography, or editing, then honestly, there is a lot to learn from this show. Anyways, if you're someone who's seen The Curse, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because I am still trying to process whatever the hell I just watched. So drop a comment and let me know if you thought that it was genius or straight up nonsense. And just a heads up, if you're gonna leave a comment trying to convince me that it was the best thing ever, I am not gonna agree with you, and I might even use some strong language to tell you just how much of a crazy person you are. But yeah, that's about it for this one. See ya.